Yes, absolutely. This was the first government in history set up not to grant individual rights, but to protect individual rights. They turned everything on its head. And now we're back to the point where people think government gives you rights. And only the rights that government gives you is something you have. The founding fathers of the United States would be, rolling over in their grave. They gave us a government which was the opposite. It was a gift to mankind, because it was the first government in history which had it exactly right. Government can't grant you rights. It could only, protect rights. And you gave government certain very limited powers and checks and balances, as you say, so they don't abuse those powers.
Yes.
And it was up to government to use very small grant of powers in order to uphold your rights. And now people don't understand it. And
are we near the end of the road to serfdom? In his two-part essay, Professor Emeritus of Economics and Leadership Barry Brownstein begs the question, drawing inspiration from Friedrich Hayek's famous book, The Road to Serfdom, published during the Second World War. We discuss the nuances of the totalitarian tiptoe, both on an individual and collective level, and Hayek's warning and message of hope. If you can see where you are now, it's not too late to change the road you're on.
Well, it's always an error to focus on behavior. The ego wants us to focus on behavior. And, some things are urgent. You got to call the plumber because you have an issue with plumbing in the house. But the ego wants us to stay on the level of behavior, not on what's going on in our minds. So how could we make an effective decision until we first made the choice for our right mind? Right? You can't make an effective decision out of your wrong mind. Mm-hmm. And if we act like the answer is, well, is it A or B? Well, it may be C. It may be something else you haven't even considered because you're in your wrong mind. Mm. And the ego will always broadcast propaganda for staying in the wrong mind. So people quite naturally, they drive themselves crazy and they bring, friends into it because the ego is always seeking for allies, right? The ego wants allies for its viewpoint. So the ego feels relieved, when a friend comes in and agrees with the ego and says, that's right.
Yeah.
And then that gets you going even more. Yeah. And then if the sane part of your mind comes in and then it says, well, that can't be right. And you're just back to on one hand and the other hand. But yeah, the fundamental choice speaks in, it's been called the still small voice because it speaks our essence. The voice that speaks for God speaks in a quiet voice. It's not shrill like the ego. Now, you can't take that as gospel because as soon as you hear that, the ego hears that and says, I'll start speaking at a still small voice also.
Yeah, let's try and match.
But the ego is not capable of that for long. The ego is always right. It's like a big brass band. It's loud and raucous, right? It's shouting its bad advice.
Yeah.
It's not very quiet. And then that still small voice gets in a word edgewise, right?
So when you're talking about all of this, Barry, what I'm also thinking about at the same time is this all sounds like you're describing on a macro level government propaganda.
Yes. Isn't that true, right? Your governments are a reflection of our ego. Reflection of whatever is the dominant egoic way of thinking.
Ah.
And right now, the dominant egoic way of thinking is safetyism, as it's been called, where the holiest of your values, you just have to say something is keeping us safe. And so government will, reflect that loud, shrill voice for safetyism. It can't help but reflect our egos, right?
Yeah.
There's, very few statespeople who will go against, collective egos right now. And you're right, government is full of propaganda that plays to our ego. It doesn't play to our higher essence, right? Because you don't have to play to our higher essence. And, finding a higher essence is an individual choice, right? It's an individual, journey. There's nobody who can make that decision for us. We have to choose it. We have to say, following my ego's voice has brought me too much pain, and I'm done with it. Now, it's not that you're done with it over and once for all.
Yeah.
But each time you chip away with it. Yeah, no, this isn't right. Like I noticed from that fish market example, I noticed again, this is something I've been seeing now for years, and I've been chipping away at it, but it's still there. And other people do the same thing, but it's about me. I'm trying to find gotchas where somebody makes a small mistake, and ego loves finding the guilty one outside of you. Well, here's the guilty one. Here it is, poor innocent me. And this guy at the fish market is not giving me the piece of fish I want. So, gotcha.
Yes.
Or, somebody in your household does something, a very minor infraction.
Yeah.
That is not up to your rules. Gotcha.
Well, that's really interesting, because then you're coming at it from the lens of a victim, right? You actually victimize yourself in your own mind, and then you're looking for the other, the it, not the thou, but you're looking at the it, and you're dehumanizing the other, and you're saying, you're victimizing me, and how dare you? And this is, again, on a macro scale, this is what we're seeing now, is that all of these impulses and this egoistic ways of being, I guess, because people are just have I don't know why. I don't know why it's happened. Maybe you have some insight as to why we're here.
Yeah, the ego's world, as you say, is victim and victimizers. That's what the ego knows, right?
Yeah.
And we're in a situation, it's a slow boat right now. The boat is going to get even faster. We're economic decline. At some point, the stock market's going to turn over and show that.
Yeah.
But the fear level is going up, and people want culprits to blame. And just to look at what's popular in the news, even pre-COVID. Let's go back to pre-COVID. It's easier to see. What's popular? Endless stories about celebrities, right? Who's the victim and who's the victimizer? And we love these stories. We love these stories because it allows us to take sides outside of ourselves and not look at the whole thought system that is, perpetuating our ego and keeping it, moving forward.
Yeah.
So there are stories of conflict. We were, speaking about Hayek's, common good. And the whole idea of the common good is predicated on conflict. If you think about it, it's win-lose thinking, because there is no common good, right?
Yeah.
There is no, common good. And since there is no common good, somebody is trying to impose their vision on other people, their values on other people.
Yeah.
So to invoke the common good is to invoke conflict. And isn't that ironic that it's portrayed as the exact opposite. It's the
Yes.
common good. Who could be against it?
The
Everybody
harbinger
wins.
of peace, right?
Right, harbinger, right, right. but it's actually win-lose thinking, right? The market is win-win thinking because everybody can win. There's infinite progress. There's infinite things that can be still discovered by entrepreneurs, by scientists, by ordinary people going about their lives. So the marketplace is inherently win-win, and government action is inherently win-lose and inherently filled with conflict and inherently trying to drag us into this victim and victimizers lens where people go from one group to another group and back and forth. And that's the world of the ego. It's destructive to our own peace of mind, to our personal peace of mind. Could you imagine somebody living their life, going through their whole life, seeing their life through the lens of victim and victimizers?
Excruciating.
Yeah,
Painful.
it's excruciating. And what a miserable life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, could you imagine coming to the end of your life on your doubt and you say, oh my God, this is how I spent my life?
Yes. Totally miserable. Just, somebody had written a comment, I forget where, on maybe one of our posts or videos or something last week, and they had said that evil was just kind of the, not only that it doesn't bring its own energy, but that evil is actually misery. And I thought that was very profound, and it relates to what you're saying here.
Yeah, it's if we're in our wrong mind, we're now miserable. We may temporarily be getting what we want, and we may temporarily feel a sense of pleasure and triumph. That's possible in the ego's world, for sure.
But hedonistically, I think hedonism is another. There's something different there with hedonism and happiness. Like actual pleasure-seeking behavior usually leads you down a self-destructive path, followed to its ends. But if you're seeking happiness, it can actually lead you in another direction.
Absolutely. Most people have the two, confused. As you say, they think happiness is pleasure. And of course, happiness does not have anything to do with pleasure. You may have pleasurable feelings, that's for sure. Pleasurable feelings will come and go. So will sad feelings come and go too. That's life, right? It's like clouds in the sky. So focusing on feelings, pleasurable feelings is a way to be, miserable your whole life. Because you're never going to get there. You're never going to arrive. If you want a pleasurable feeling out of a new car or a boat or a new girlfriend or whatever, there's always going to be more. You're always going to be dissatisfied. There's always going to be one more thing that you would need to get. And the research is clear that your real happiness has nothing to do with one researcher called it puddles of pleasure. Because they're going to evaporate very quickly.
Right. Well, this is interesting because I was looking up recently utilitarianism as a philosophy, and I wanted to find out more about how it was constructed. And greater good is an inherent quality to utilitarianism. And also part of the explanation of greater good by some philosophers is that it's called aggregation, right? Where you're trying to add up the sums of the most people's pleasure, which I thought was really interesting. So the greater good is related to seeking that hedonistic path rather than a path of meaning. And then that's considered the sum of all of everybody's pleasure minus their pain is what gets you to the greater good. Isn't that interesting?
Well, it's absurd, of course, because it can't be measured.
Right.
And as Hayek says, it can't be placed on a single scale of less and more. Even if somehow you could measure it, you couldn't put it on a single scale. So it is pretty crazy, isn't it? It is pretty crazy. And people mindlessly just say these things. They say, well, it's for the greater good, as though that's going to end discussion.
Yes.
I invoke the holiest of holies, the greater good, and now shut up, right?
Well, this is what you hear all the time, right? You just go on any Facebook comments, about where you see that there's opposing, I don't even know if you can call them arguments, but viewpoints about, the COVID response and different things.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you'll always see invoked, somewhere near the end of the discussion, where somebody will say, well, we're doing this for everybody else's well-being, and that's another way of saying the greater good. And then it's always you're selfish. And we know the whole spiel. We've been watching this grow. And you kind of wrap this up in your piece. Are we at the end of the road to serfdom? In the second part, because it's a two-part piece. But in the second part, when you talk about the lowest common denominator.
Yes. I am glad you're bringing that up. You're right, because mass movements will always go to that lowest common denominator, because that's where the greatest amount of common values can be found or manipulated. Right. So, if, for instance, with COVID, for instance, you're not going to find any type of agreement with people should eat well, they should exercise, they should not engage in things that get themselves angry or whatever, because anger will impact their immune system too. So if you come up with a program that somebody follows, you follow, you try and eat well, exercise, all these things, try and, regulate your spiritual world and say, well, that's the way I try and get immunity. Well, you're not going to find any type of agreement about that, right? Because even about food intake, you're not going to find any type of, but you can find agreement about, I'm going to get a shot. I'm going to get it. Get it, right? It's not a process. You get it. Now, health is not something you get. Health is a process, right?
Right.
It's not so. The lowest common denominator starts with, I'm going to get it. Because you don't get anything in life. It's like going back to happiness, right? So you don't get happiness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You engage in a process that produces happiness indirectly. Happiness is always obtained indirectly.
Yeah.
Well, health is obtained as you engage in a process. It's not something you get. So lowest common is going to be get. That's what something the masses can understand. I'm getting it. I'm going to go line up and get my shot.
So
and
this
get
is
my
the
test.
drive-through of health. It's the fast food drive-through. And we literally see that, right? You see these lineups for, I've never understood it till now. When you see these lineups of people going for their rapid tests and mass vaccination centers, and they say, we're going to all go at the same time, even though we should be distanced, we shouldn't be seeing anybody else. But you know what? In the lineup, it's okay because we're going to get our health. So we're going to get that shot.
We're going to get it. Or, go to the airport and you see these, TSA lines in the United States. I guess you have it in, Canada too for screening. And everybody's, you penned into these closed areas to pass through the security line, and you're going to get secured. You're going to get it.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That is so true too. Like, and you know that it's actually not, it's the least secure. You're there, you're opening up
Right,
all of your bags, your wallets, your
right.
passports, you're throwing them, into bins. You're standing 30 feet away waiting for this to come while you're standing there having to take your belt off and your shoes and everything. But somebody's standing there with your toothpaste and saying,
Right,
this is too much now. This is what's going to keep you
right,
keep
right,
you back.
right, right. Easy to understand rules, right? You gotta give
Mm,
easy to understand rules because something, refined is very, difficult for the masses and to follow. So, for instance, there's, all types of your diets which start with the premise eat whole foods,
hmm.
right? Eat unrefined whole foods as a pathway to health.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't follow from that how somebody should eat. Somebody may follow that rule and thrive on a keto diet, and somebody may follow that rule and thrive mostly, vegetarian.
Yeah.
But eating whole foods, it doesn't mean eating Impossible Burgers, for instance.
Mm.
Vegetarian who's eating Impossible Burgers, right? It's not whole foods, so they're not going to thrive. Somebody who says they're, keto, but eating only industrial animal food
Yeah.
is not going to thrive either.
Yeah.
So eating whole foods involves a degree of responsibility that the average person is not prepared to take. So government says absolutely nothing. Throughout this crisis, have they said anything about eating well, about cutting down on alcohol, which suppresses the immune system? In
Right.
fact, liquor stores during the peak of the lockdowns, they were all open
Right.
anyway as an
Right.
essential business.
Right.
So I'm not saying they should have been closed, but
Yeah.
I'm saying it just shows the way that people think just the lowest common denominator that people can understand. Go get it. Have you ever heard of the silver rule as opposed to the golden rule?
No.
The silver rule says, don't do unto others what you would not want done unto yourself.
Oh, yes, I know that. Yes.
Yeah. So don't do unto others what you don't. So isn't it amazing that people want to do to others what they would not want to do to themselves, throughout this crisis, because they've gotten a shot.
Yeah.
So they want to demand everybody else get a shot.
Right.
It's as though somebody would get a demand because I shaved my head, you need to shave your head.
Right.
So if people just follow the silver rule, don't do unto others what you would not do to yourself.
Yes.
Don't force somebody to do to their body if you don't want somebody to force you to do something with your body. But again, easy to get agreement on cheap us versus them. Here are the unclean,
Yeah.
and here are the clean, and let's put them into easy to understand, categories, and let's not, deviate from this narrative. Even though now we're at the stage where even the scientific experts admit now the current vaccines do not work against Omicron. And somehow people think it's logical that the answer is more boosters of shots that don't work. And
Wow.
right, isn't that crazy?
It is. I think it's the impulses of the lowest common denominator. They don't really involve higher logic, though. We've seen that
right,
in almost
right.
2 years now. And I want to just read something here from Hayek, where he says, "It seems to be almost a law of human nature that it is easier for people to agree on a negative program, on the
Right.
hatred of an enemy, on the envy of those better off, than on any positive task. The contrast between the we and the they, the common fight against those outside the group, seems to be an essential ingredient in any creed which will solidly knit together a group for common action.
Yeah. And that was the tragedy of the 20th century, right? Where hundreds of millions were killed in Stalinist Russia, Hitler's Germany, Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, North Korea. Literally hundreds of millions of people. And isn't it beyond belief, with the examples from history of hundreds of millions of people, that people still believe that government could bring us to the common good? When it's beyond belief, because in every one of these examples, the common good was invoked.
Yes. Yes, but most people don't know that. And I think that that's part of the flaw, is that the education system is so terrible, that you don't look at history that way. Like, there's no why. You just look back, when you go to school and they tell you, well, there was this really bad dude named Hitler, and he killed all the Jews. And then the Americans came in and the Allies, and they saved the day. The end. Now we're going to go on to the next program. Like, that's pretty much what you're taught. So if people don't understand what is the spiritual reasonings for everything that's happened, then of course they have no clue that this is going on in similar ways now.
Yeah, no, you raised, great points, because in the educational system as it is now, there's no space for curiosity. Right. Kids are not taught to be curious. And the interesting thing is that if you're not curious, you're not tolerant for uncertainty. Life is uncertain. And certainly more so than other times right now, there's uncertainty. And people want to, in part because of schooling, in part because of their egos, they want to reduce uncertainty, and government promises to reduce uncertainty. If you follow their program, their lowest common denominator program, they will reduce uncertainty, even though what they're saying now is logically inconsistent and absurd. The boosters cannot possibly work because they're not for this variant. And we're going to give more and more and more, and we're going to follow that. And people are not curious at all. They don't start to investigate. Now, there are people who are starting to investigate. That's a very healthy sign, because, society will move on as people start to get off the train, start to investigate for themselves, there'll be great shifts in the external world. But right now, by and by, people are not curious about what they're being fed.
Yeah.
And that's in part because of the educational system. The fascinating thing is, if we make an empty space in our mind about anything, where we're open to being curious, open to being uncertain, the theories, the information that we need to be more effective in life will come rushing in. Often we don't get them because we're blocking it up with a full head that makes no room for anything.
Right.
And that's what government education is designed to do. To make no room. How sad it was in that video that you just shared today about the common good. It's an excellent video.
Thank you.
And it was chilling to see that speech by a high school student. Right? It was I think she was a high school student. Yeah. Who was just mindlessly spitting up propaganda.
Yeah.
And people find it offensive, but I say it anyway, and I will continue to write offensive essays in this way. But the same mindset could have been in Stalinist Russia, Hitler's Germany, just school children spitting out mindless, propaganda.
Yeah.
And how sad to think that the, Western world thinks it will go forward and continue to, progress. It won't.
Yeah.
If they educate people who are not curious and who can't think for themselves and who can't see through the most shallow, mindless, mass-produced propaganda. It's, very sad, isn't it?
It is. And I think that you've highlighted something really important here as well. I'm thinking about psychological and spiritual studies and self-study. And in that space, one of the things that often comes up is that one of the ways to escape your feelings is to intellectualize your problems, right? And to just overthink, to think about your problems, to read about your problems, to Google your problems, as I was saying before, right? And so that's how to escape that. And so then if you look at the education system, that's what you basically have is a whole bunch of intellectual stuff thrown at you that you're supposed to just gobble up. And then you're supposed to write an exam on it. And then you're supposed to move on to the next thing after you've memorized that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have seen many of so-called very bright people who think they're very bright. Other people have told them they're very bright. They have tested well on tests. Mm-hmm. But their curiosity, quotient is about 0. And they, as a consequence, are not very good problem solvers, are not very good thinkers, because being a good thinker starts with being able to ask a good question, right? Mm-hmm. So if you can't ask a good question, you can't be a good thinker.
Yeah.
The fact that you could ask a good question means that you have left space in your mind to be curious about the problem. Mm-hmm. And then being able to ask a good question will open up the door to solving the problem.
Right.
And if we intellectualize it, Einstein said, very famous quote, you can't solve a problem at the same level that you created it. Obviously, you can't. How could you? Right? You have to open up the door for something fresh and new. Opening up the door for something fresh and new means emptying some space in your mind. Of all the concepts that are occupying it. I think we talked about last time about NPR syndrome, where people sit in front of all day and hear NPR or CNN, and citizens, here's what you need to know. You can ignore everything else.
Right. So why are people attracted to that? Why do you think that they do this?
Wow. Yeah, that is the $64,000 question. And why in this time in history are more people seemingly attracted to that? Are they seemingly attracted to that, or have they always been attracted to it? Mm-hmm. Is it that they've always been attracted to it, and now during a crisis, it becomes apparent how bad it's gotten? We ate our seed corn for respect for intellectual processes, the rule of law, all these things. We've eaten our seed corn and there's nothing left. The idea of eating your seed corn is usually applied to something physical.
Yeah.
But you could think about it as something applied to something and ideas too. So during hard economic times, during a crisis, it's harder for people to back off their need for certainty. It's harder for people to back off the egoic need to find a victimizer, to find somebody to blame. And a free society, to maintain its freedom, has to be able to have the spiritual strength to produce some leaders that don't encourage the population to indulge in such, primitive thinking
Yeah.
because that's such a society that collectively indulges in such primitive thinking will not stay free for long.
Yeah.
That's an ironclad law of history.
So you're kind of saying that people don't have the emotional, spiritual reserves, so that they don't have really much to draw on when they get into this situation. That it's a kind of spiritual crisis. Well, if there's nothing there, and you know, Carl Jung talked about this. What happens with the society that loses its individual relationship with God, not just the religious institutions, because that can just be like another form of government, you know, and historically it has been just another central planning authority. But what happens when you have this loss of spirituality on a broad level? Well, that void is filled in other ways, and then there's nothing to look towards inside yourself when the seed corn has all but been eaten.
Yeah. Some people have been very isolated for the past few years, and if they have no human, connections, and they have no spiritual connections, what's left other than their own narrow thinking?
Yes.
That's what's left, and to fall victim to these mass-produced, propaganda.
Yeah.
And easy to see why it happens, and easy to see how it can get worse. That's a scary thing. Easy to see how it can easily get much worse. Just imagine a stock market bear market of 50% or 70% on top of what we already have right now with the crisis over COVID. And you could easily imagine how much worse it could get, how much more fear the government can exploit, and how many more promises they can make that they're going to cut away uncertainty, which is an absurd thing. Anybody who can think for themselves must be able to know government cannot eliminate uncertainty. This is absurd. So how do people fall for this nonsense? But they do.
Well, this is what's interesting, and this is kind of one of the fundamental connections that I perceive between economics and your societal structure, is that when you have a societal structure that is based upon collectivist principles and authoritarian kind of central control, you're going to have economic systems that are built upon that, and you can't untie them from each other, right? So then you're going to have either a society that has a free market and that the individuals are more free to act and trade and behave as they see fit in their own lives, or you have the government which controls. If the government controls the market, they also will control your life. So I think what we're going to see here and what we're seeing is that they're doing both right now. And we're really focused on the societal aspects of that because that's what we feel and that's what we see. We see the prices raising at the supermarket and things like that. But for people to actually contextualize what you're talking about, this bear market, the stock market crashing eventually, these are huge effects. And the economic collapses that were associated as well with 20th century collectivism is another part of history that is not very well explained.
Yeah, absolutely. People they don't know history, they don't know economics, and as you said earlier, they're taught just the great man theory of history, where they're just taught names and dates. And so Hitler, if they even understand Hitler, it's meaningless, as you say, because he was a bad man, and we don't have to understand what produced Hitler. We just have to have good men. Well, and they don't understand, again, it goes back to a process. It's not, okay, we'll have an election and elect a good man. No, that's not how it works. That's not how it works.
Yes.
The founding of the United States was based on a system which would have a process to protect individual rights. And they didn't envision something you get. It's not something you get, individual rights. It's a process whereby you defend individual rights, and it's an ongoing process that people have to understand what system protects individual rights, helps some human beings, flourish, and are the people able to commit to such a system. And now there's almost just a tiny percentage of the population understands any of this. It goes back to, again, so they're going to get it. So they're going to get a good society or a good government the same way they got a shot.
Yeah.
Right? They have no idea of process.
Yeah, that's very insightful. Yeah. And I think too that if you look at the foundation of the United States, the reason why it was so different from any other country that exists to this day, right, was because they wanted to escape the kind of imperialism or other kind of democracies, which had always this veto power at the top, and so wanted to separate from that system. And so what I think differentiated, my understanding, what differentiated the foundation of the United States was that the government was there actually for the first time to protect individual rights and to ensure those rights. And it was also at the same time, there were checks and balances put in to protect it against itself, against the government itself. Yeah. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. This was the first government in history set up not to grant individual rights, but to protect individual rights. They turned everything on its head. And now we're back to the point where people think government gives you rights. And only the rights that government gives you is something you have. The founding fathers of the United States would be rolling over in their grave. They gave us a government which was the opposite. It was a gift to mankind, because it was the first government in history which had it exactly right. Government can't grant you rights; it could only protect rights. And you gave government certain very limited powers and checks and balances, as you say, so they don't abuse those powers.
Yes.
And it was up to government to use very small grant of powers in order to uphold your rights. And now people don't understand it. And when you think about it, the situation is very, very bleak. It is very dire. We cannot overstate how dire it is, because if people do not understand that basic concept, then of course, as you said earlier, it's not taught in the educational system. Mm-hmm. So how could they understand, except if people are homeschooled? And I urge parents, even if you have to send your kid to the public school, and I get it that sometimes you have no choice about it. You can't give up the second income. I understand that parents have sometimes very hard financial decisions to make. You cannot just stand by and not educate your kids on the side too. There are things you can do.
Yes.
So that they get a balanced program of education.
Right.
There's an excellent book, The Well-Trained Mind, by a mother-daughter team, Susan Weiss Bauer and Jesse Wise. And it's a guide to classical education in the home. And it's aimed for homeschoolers, but it can be used by any parent who's interested in supplementing the bad education their kids are getting at school. And mind you, even in the best schools right now, children are getting bad education because they're not taught some very important, crucial things that they need to know, such as that government is there to uphold your rights, not to grant you rights. I mean, how many kids, learn that even in the best schools these days. You're very,
Yeah.
very few.
But why would they? I mean, when you have public schooling, which is just an arm of government, you also have
Hmm.
private schools, which seems to be sometimes where people have, in some cases, a better shot. But then those schools also have, many of them have taken upon the progressive programs, which,
Hmm.
the progressivism has also led down this path, the road to serfdom further, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
all about progress, quote unquote progress, but it's not really about that. It's actually about, again, subordinating the individual for some kind of ideological program.
Absolutely. And your people like John Taylor Gatto have shown that the your primary purpose of education is socialization, not education. Socialization to obey.
Yeah.
Every state wants their children to obey. And now it's chilling, again, to go back what you put in your film, and there's examples of that all over the internet where school children are becoming mindless, robots. They're set up to obey, and you wonder what are they going to be obeying in the future. You can only imagine. In an economic crisis, we see what's happened during COVID, and as I said earlier, add on an economic crisis where the fear level in the population goes up. And you could only start to imagine, it's chilling to imagine what people will obey if they're obeying this now.
Yes.
What are they going to obey if you add an economic crisis on top of what we already have? I can't even imagine. I know that politicians will rise up to exploit the fear level in the population. You could count on that.
Yes.
And I can't even imagine if people don't wake up and start to see what's happening and start to engage in their inner work, but also to study the great works of history. Road to Serfdom is only a couple of hundred pages. It's not a 500-page book, for instance, and there's so many great books that people can start to learn more and more and more. And it's fine to hear us, talk about it, fine to read, fine to see your films. All those things are important too. But go back to the source material also.
Yes. Reading. Imagine in your own mind, right? I think that this is one of the effects of having a majority population who doesn't actually read for fun anymore, is that there's this inquisitive nature is related to that, right? Is your imagination and looking at the characters and trying to see in your own mind's eye, what does this look like?
Yeah, I mean, oh man, you're going to get me going over here because I know so many professionals who, since they graduated either undergraduate school or if they have an advanced degree, graduate school, have not read anything. They may read some fiction for fun.
Yeah.
But have they read anything to advance their understanding of the world? No, they've gone to seed as soon as they graduated school. They've intellectually gone to seed. And these people claim to be, professionals. Anders Ericsson was a famous psychologist whose work about, practice is very, very important. And he showed that often in professions, people after 20, 30 years in the profession, they got worse, not better. You would think a surgeon, for instance, would get better after 20, 30 years of practice, but they got worse. How'd they get worse? Because they never learned anything new, and they never tried to practice what they already weren't good at.
Right.
So they, so they never tried to improve on what they already weren't good at, and they didn't learn anything new. Yeah.
Yeah, this is actually a really good point that relates as well to something that you wrote in the second part of how far along are we? Are we near the end of the road to serfdom? Which is that many of the doctors and scientists in the Nazi regime were gung-ho first subscribers to the program, and we're seeing the parallels now with this kind of medical tyranny. And that's I think what I've seen on an individual personal level, is when I was pregnant, was that my doctor had no idea about anything that was happening. Like, I actually knew more about the scientific studies that were coming out around COVID and around masks and around lockdowns and everything else and around restrictions and what this was doing than she did. And it was just mind blowing, because I said, you're in the field of health, but you haven't thought to look at this paper that was produced, by a medical journal, which shows you the harms of having a whole generation of babies born and socially distanced from their mothers when they're born, wearing masks, all of these things. Like, where is the disconnect there? And I've seen it firsthand, because I've had to be in the hands of medical professionals in the last year and a half, and it's mind blowing.
Yeah, that it's so powerful what you're saying. After this essay, I started to dig into the issue further that you raise. I'm going to have a separate essay about this.
Yeah.
Because during the Nazi era, sadly, physicians were by far the group that were the most enthusiastic supporters of Hitler. It's amazing. And you're right, your doctors by and by. If you think about it right now, so many doctors are in hospital-based practices. So their orders come from above. So, for instance, if you're in a hospital-based practice, you have to offer the flu shot, even if you think it doesn't work, which is a whole separate topic. Spoiler alert, the flu shot doesn't work.
I think I'm going to have to censor that out. I'm just going to put a black tape over your mouth there.
No, the Cochrane collaboration. With the Cochrane collaboration, which is the primary evidence-based group in the world, has done careful meta studies of all these studies on flu shots. And I'll say it again, it doesn't work, so you'll have to censor it out twice. So
we're going to put a little FDA, CDC kind of a strip that goes along the bottom. For information, please visit cdc.gov.
That's right. You are going to have to edit this out, otherwise you're not going to be able to post it on YouTube.
I think if we put the little scroll there, we might be able to save ourselves.
Okay, but anyway, if you're in a hospital-based practice, right, and you're instructed, you have to offer a flu shot to all patients. How do you resolve your cognitive dissonance about this? If you have a sense it doesn't work, or if you've seen some of these studies, you say, I'm not interested in finding out anymore. I don't want to learn. I don't want to study about this, because I have to go in every day in order to keep my job. Now, somebody could say, I've had enough of this hospital-based practice. I'm going to be an independent. They could do that.
Right.
But if they've decided they're keeping their job, in order for them to not see themselves as a bad person, they have to deny the evidence, and the easiest way to deny the evidence is to not read about it in the first place. Is to just have, is to simply have NPR on in the background. Citizens, here's what you need to know.
Yeah, I think you've tapped into it. Yeah.
So, your doctors who know something about nutrition have said over and over again, they have explored the fact that in medical school they learn nothing about nutrition. So just imagine that. Just imagine, isn't that mind-blowing? Your primary, if you're focused on a process as opposed to getting a shot or getting a pill,
yes,
right? If you're focused on a process, the primary thing has to be to find food that suits your body, right? And there's biochemical individuality, so that there's not one size fits all food diet that is suitable for everybody. But as I said earlier, it involves whole foods.
Yes.
But if you don't know anything about diet, nutrition, sure, and all you have is 10 minutes to have an office visit, how could you do anything but to give out a pill? And some patients feel disappointed if they don't get a pill. They go home, and the first thing their friends and family ask them is, what did the doctor say? What did the doctor say? As though the doctor is some holy person who's going to, give them something that they get, right? They go to the pharmacy, they get it, and then they're saved. And so they can go back to sleep until their symptoms again flare up and they got to go get their meds adjusted, right? But they pay no attention to a process and they have no interest in a process. And it's an unholy alliance between patients and their healthcare prescribers to not get into the process. Yes. Because the system does not support educating anybody about this process that maintains health.
Right. That's a fantastic point. And I can actually imagine a specific individual in my mind who is exactly like that. And the same person also has NPR syndrome. They listen to all day long, right? So it's kind of like this garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
Right. And we say that in the audio visual world, right? Like you want to get the best possible, if you have garbage coming in, you're going to have garbage coming out on the other end in your production. Right. You want to have the best possible input. And this is what we're seeing with health, right? So it's garbage in, garbage out, whether we're looking at spiritual health, psychological health, physical health. This is what we've seen now in the common denominator seems to be garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, absolutely. Your output, as you say, is going to be, determined by your input. So watch what comes in and, guard that, guard what comes into your mind, guard what comes into your mouth, and then you'll have, good output. And geez, NPR on all day, and then at night there's, more noise on in the background, and how many people say they can't fall asleep if they don't have the, television, going on in the background,
yes.
And it's usually reruns of some cop show where everybody,
and the good guys, just like history, right? It's just the good guys who are going to come save the day for you.
The good guys are going to come save the day.
Yeah.
And well, guess what? There's nobody coming to save us as a society. There's nobody coming to save us. I mean, there are politicians who do reflect our best instincts, but right now, as the collective consciousness of our countries are right now, they can't be elected.
Yes.
Rand Paul is not going to be elected in 2024. Yes. He can't save us all by himself anyway, but if he was electable, it would mean that we were ready to save ourselves because there would be a big enough shift in our consciousness that he may be able to get a sane program passed through Congress. But individually, he can't save us. But yeah, you're right. We are just depressing ourselves today.
Right. But no, but it's I think it's important though too to actually face reality, because if we're not looking at where we are in fact, then we're just doing another kind of intellectualizing, another kind of mind-numbing behavior and just ignoring what's actually incumbent upon us. And I think it's very important discussion to be had, and hopefully something that people will want to talk about at home, because that's where it changes as well. If you're reading the books, if you don't have time to read or you don't want to read, if you're listening to a conversation like this or a podcast or watching a video, or even if you're doing none of that, but you're just, like you said, creating the space to just think and to just allow yourself to do some work and to behave better, to actually be a person who is more whole and to behave better, well then, as you said in our last chat, then you have a society who doesn't require the services of the kinds of politicians that we have now, who are spewing hatred and brewing the collectivist propaganda garbage pot.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now, those type of conversations are hard for people to have, even in their own families.
Yes.
People don't want to hear alternative views. I think people who are inclined towards freedom are very capable of understanding and hearing alternative views. They understand where people are coming from, and I think we by and by can talk to people respectfully about these things. But often on the other side, people don't even want to have the conversation, because that's the only way, again, to go back to the concept of just dissidence. They can resolve it by not hearing that there is another view, because then they don't have to confront their own illogic and their own fact that they're not engaged in a process. Forget about society. They're not engaged in a process that's going to produce good results for themselves. That would be an interesting essay, wouldn't it? The whole, get it, mentality, because as we're uncovering in this conversation, it pervades everything: education, healthcare, everything.
Yeah.
And, going back to doctors, what you brought up earlier, and other professionals, people get it, they get their degree, and then by and by, they think they don't have to do anything else. Right. They've tuned out. Could you imagine by and by, those who are teaching our children in schools and colleges?
Yeah.
By and by, are not engaged in a process of continuous learning. They've gone to seed. Our healthcare professionals have gone to seed. I'm not talking about everybody. Obviously, there are very good teachers, doctors out there, but they are the exception. Anders Ericsson has shown this, that most people go to seed, they stop learning, they stop practicing, and they don't get any better. Or if they practice, they just practice what they already know. And what they already know doesn't work. So they're getting better at what doesn't work.
Yeah. And what's funny is that I've also noticed that when it comes to adulthood, you see now there's all of these memes about adulting, and people not wanting to grow up, which is really interesting, but saying, but I've reached it. I'm at the milestone now. I'm officially adulting. And what's interesting here is that it's almost like they've done the same thing with adulting by saying, I've got it now. Now I'm 30. I've got it. I'm an adult. And so what happens is they end up actually just projecting all of their psychological trash onto their kids. And we can tie a line there, because we see how the whole of society has sacrificed children over the last 2 years, which is the future, which is the next generation. And we are traumatizing them beyond recognition. We don't know what will happen down the line with these children. And it comes down to, I've got it. I'm an adult now. You're the kid. I'm going to throw all my crap onto you and treat you the same terrible ways in which I've been treated to alleviate myself from that temporarily, and I think that speaks as well for where we are.
Absolutely. As you get older, I think if you're engaged in a genuine process, if somebody offered you the chance to go back, and say, go back to when you were 20 or 25, that should be very unattractive, because as you get older, if you're engaged in a process, you're going to get wiser.
Yes.
If you think, great, I'll go for that, that probably means you haven't really gone forward in your, wisdom, right?
Yeah.
And so many people would go for it, I think. They haven't gotten, wiser. And wow, I could see exactly what you're saying. That does explain a lot, right, about what, we see with kids these days. Wow. So they're turned over to government schools
Mm-hmm.
and they're not getting parenting at home.
Yeah.
And wow, it's a very toxic, combination, isn't it?
Yes. And they're being parentified in a way too. They're also, because everybody has become so infantilized and the government is fully supporting that and enabling that, and creating those circumstances in some ways as well. You have the kids who are now taking all of that baggage on their own shoulders, right? And they're not being allowed to have their childhood. And this is like, you see this a lot in many districts where, for example, adults can go out and be unmasked in different social situations, but then the same adults want their children to be masked at school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's amazing what's happening to children, and they're put in daycare. How early do some parents put their kids in daycare?
Yeah.
It's like they've been, as you say, institutionalized their whole life. I can't even imagine that. I grew up in an era where some of the things I was allowed to do would be examples now of child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but the actual child abuse that people are doing is supported by the institutions.
right.
So there's institutional child abuse, right?
Yeah.
But like, actual children being able to be free and being able to explore and being able to, create some potential is child abuse now.
Yeah, you're just,
Inverted.
being able to go out on your own with your friends and, play for, a couple of hours without a parent around, was something that was common. It was, commonplace. We would even get on the subway, go to, museums on our own at 9, 10 years old. The parents were okay with that.
Right.
I mean, could you imagine that? Well, now it wouldn't be safe, unfortunately, because, society has gotten so bad. But even if it was safe, it would be something that would be, wouldn't be allowed. So,
well, there was actually a lady who did this. I forget her last name, but she wrote a book about it called Free Range Kids.
Mm-hmm.
And she had equipped her 8-year-old with the subway map, with all of these preparatory exercises. And he wanted to go and take an hour and just do the little loop and come back home. And he was so proud of himself and he was so happy. And when he had come home, for some reason, it had like made the local news and then it had made like national news. And she thought that they were bringing her on to say, you've done such a great exercise for your kid. And instead, the mob was attacking her.
Here's an interesting story about that. So we hiked as a family. There's White Mountains, New Hampshire. There's 48 peaks above 4,000 feet.
Wow.
And there's a group that tracks people who, complete all 48 peaks because some of them are very, hard to climb. They involve long, bushwhacks, long distances. Big stream, that you have to cross and all this other stuff. Anyway, we hiked it as a family, starting when the kids were 7. And they became among the youngest, children to ever finish all 48. There's a group, as I said, that keeps the stats. Anyway, we were on one of the last peaks. And so this peak involved 18 miles. As I said, your bushwhacking involved. You had to go up and down a big slide, a couple of thousand feet on a slide, 2 major stream crossings. And somebody stopped us on the trail and said, you're guilty of child abuse for having your kids out here.
Oh, my goodness.
But in actuality, now that was the exception. We didn't get that kind of stuff often. On the contrary, the kids kind of became famous by other hikers who had encountered them, and then other people started to hear about them, and then sometimes on the trail, so they'd get stopped, and so oh, well, you're the kids who are hiking the 48. So they
Wow.
became famous. So most people were good about it, but there were some people who weren't. And it was absolutely amazing because the kids built up a lifelong skills through the planning of each trip. We carefully, progressed in the difficulty for each hike, and they had to gain physical and psychological skills, both. And so these are skills that they still have that serve them well. But to some people saw it as something you shouldn't do,
Yes. Yes.
which is interesting in and of itself, isn't it? About the
Well,
attitude of some people about kids.
right. Right. And I think that that's also a big part of the reason that this is where we're at. Like, if you recall in George Orwell's 1984, you actually had all of the children who were tattletaling, so-called, on their parents, and they were, it was like the generation of children were actually so indoctrinated because the parents had become so passive and morally corrupt. And then their children had, no foundation, no real chance, to have themselves be educated in those ways that you specify by their parents or by, mentors around them. So the state kind of took control of the children. And this is what we're seeing now. And so we can end up in a really scary place, like you're saying, in 10 years or so, or 15 or 20 or 5 or 3. I don't really know what it will look like.
Yeah. Sadly, I think it's going to come upon us sooner than we can imagine. But to be fair, I've been, predicting doom and gloom for quite a few years already. So hopefully I'll continue to be wrong. I think the best thing we could hope for now is somehow we, muddle through and things don't get too bad. Because if we do, muddle through, then we could build on that. I know there are people who are eager for a collapse. They think something good will come out of some type of collapse. I am not eager for a collapse. I think the odds are very high that something bad will come out of a collapse, not something good. If you mean something good will come after 50 years, perhaps, but I'm concerned about the next 10, 20, 30 years. And out of a collapse, there's nothing good that will come out of that. And I'm not eager for that. I hope we somehow muddle through, and slowly but surely people start to change. They start to open up their minds and make these individual changes that count, because any type of collapse, as we said earlier, will mean that your politicians, and as Hayek explained, will exploit it. As I did write in my essays about Hayek, the first few times I read The Road to Serfdom, it seemed very academic in places. Okay, this is interesting about what happened somewhere else one time. But Hayek intended it as a warning, and it didn't seem like a warning that was going to happen, that we were in imminent threat, and now we are in imminent threat. And his warning just leaps out from the pages at us, change now, even though it was written in 44. The warning, the insights he had about what led to tyrannies are very, very apropos. We see the same thing you're playing out right now, but people can change their minds. But as we said earlier, also, they won't change their minds when their fear level goes up. And so any type of economic collapse or societal collapse will increase fear levels and cut down on the odds that collectively we will change our minds. So I do disagree with people who think, bring on a collapse, we'll then have a free society afterwards. Unlikely. In the aftermath of collapse, we will have a much more unfree society.
So, in heeding the warning of the road to serfdom, I just like to actually look at towards the end of your piece. You always end your pieces with a message of hope, which I can really appreciate because you see the potential for destruction, which makes your messages of hope all the more appealing because they're authentic. So I just like to read what you've written here. To turn off the road to serfdom, Hayek challenges us to see how we have denied the truth. Quote, the first need is to free ourselves of that worst form of contemporary obscurantism, which tries to persuade us that what we have done in the recent past was all either wise or inevitable. We shall not grow wiser before we learn that much that what we have done was very foolish.
Yes. Yes, and if we can't see that as a society, we could see it in our own individual lives, right? If we are open to not defending the path that the ego has taken us down individually, we can see that's how we change, right? That's the source of individual change, to stop defending what we've already done. Right? That's what Hayek says. Stop defending what you've already done, and then stop your denial of the truth, right? Hayek points us to ways that human societies flourish. And we have really denied the truth of what Hayek has to say. So we stop the denial. It's a process of subtraction again. And by stopping to deny the truth, then the truth is left, right? And that's the same in our own life. If we can't see that as a collective process, well, it starts with the individual. But if we can't see that on a societal level, we could again just see it in our own individual life.
Yes.
We stop defending our mistakes, and we stop, our denial of the truth that we are more than our ego. That's the basic ego strategy, to deny there's anything more than the stream of chatter in your head. The ego, that's the basic, strategy. And so those two things, together are a powerful pathway to change in our own lives and for societal change also.
And I'd like to just cap off what you've said very beautifully with something that a wise friend of mine told me, who is a rogue politician who actually is of the individualist sort. And what he told me was, right now, what we have is a collectivist problem. The problems won't be solved collectively. What we need to a collectivist problem is an individualist solution. And so I find that fits nicely with what you've said there.
Right. Absolutely. The only entity that could change its mind is individuals, right?
Yes.
And as people have pointed out, a very important thing why we don't want this to go too much further down the road to serfdom. We've gone a long way. We don't want to go too much further because, unlike in the marketplace, if you don't like the product you buy, if you buy a package of, ground turkey, for instance, and you don't like it, you don't buy that brand again, right? You have an instant change. The next time you go to the supermarket, there's instant change. If you don't like the politician you elect, there's no obvious way to get instant change. So we have to be very careful how far down we go down this collectivist path, because even though the pathway to change is individuals, unlike in our personal lives, the change cannot occur as fast as it can. So we don't want to go any further because we will find ourselves in quicksand that we will not be easily able to get out. So Hayek's warnings are very, very urgent for today.
Excellent. Well, I think that this is a great place to cap this part of our conversation in recording anyhow. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure because such an interactive impact. as each of us shares our ideas. And I think something more than is in each of us comes out of the conversation. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry.